Smashing. So, welcome back, everyone, to the GCS podcast. I'm Chris Tasker, and I'm delighted today to be talking to some quite long-time friends now and very respected colleagues, Ben and Aurelian from Augur Associates. And they've just produced a beautiful report that's comprehensive and incredibly detailed that outlines what's going on in the French medical cannabis ecosystem. And so they've kindly donated some of their time today to walk us through it, some of the findings from their report, what's going on in France, what we have to look forward to, maybe some challenges, maybe some opportunities. And we have Ben and Aurelian, who are two of the best, most, I think, esteemed thought leaders in the French cannabis industry, with all the momentum that's building, it seems like, in France. Benjamin and Aurelian, please introduce yourselves and say hello to the GCS community.
Thank you. Aurelian, you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for hosting us. Just a quick recap, like you said, about where we come from. So I'm Aurelian. I created Newsweek.fr 10 years ago to 15, which is today's leading cannabis media in France. We are writing daily about cannabis news, legal and worldwide. And it's a non-advocating media. Try to stay as more objective possible. But I have some personal thoughts about cannabis reform and cannabis laws, and that's how I met Benjamin, which has more an advocating profile when I met him. And we started our adventure with some advocating events and association, and we co-created then the hemp union in France as a syndicat professionnel du chanvre, which we accompany for 2 years, and then we figured that business was a part of decision for political leaders in France, and that's how we began to create Augur, believing that bringing more forces to French market will help to make things move for the law in France, and that's how we started Augur, and we couldn't make more things before medical cannabis came in France, and that's what we will talk about today. But we are really enjoy to be there after 10 years of work.
To complete, on my side, as Aurelian said, I come from more of the political science and international relations. So that's how I started working on drug policies. And after coming back to France, working in drug policy reform, trying to support civil society-led organizations and initiatives, that's how we met with Aurélien, and that's how we came to co-create the professional hemp union he mentioned, because at the time it was the CBD kind of beginning, and the flower wasn't touched by the historical hemp association in France. So there was a need to for better representation, and we managed it for a while and came to the conclusion, as Aurélien said, that we could be of use by helping professionalize those new burgeoning fields. So obviously in France, but we have activities a little bit everywhere in the world, on all the legal markets around the plant, depending on where we are. We do a lot of regulatory advisory for governments and administration. And then we work with the private sector and companies that want to engage in those markets. Obviously, our legitimacy is on France, but since Aurélien said, we've been there for almost a decade. So that's a good thing that we don't work just in France, because the CBD has been advancing with its up and downs, and there's less thing, I think, to do there for consultancy. And now that France is finally coming online with its medical cannabis regulation, it's a little bit like coming. It's Augur with its raison d'être, as we say in French. So it's core identity. The reason why we exist is really aligned with what we do in medical cannabis in France and how we've helped open the market, structure it, and now accompany players to come into the market.
Beautiful, gentlemen. Thank you. Got a bit of a taste of the why you're part of the cannabis industry, why you wanted to set up a company, why Aurelian you founded Newsread as well to try and get some of that information out there and share some of the changes and key information that people were sort of lacking around cannabis. I guess a bit of transparency really overall around what's going on in the sort of cannabis movement in France. But if I may ask to sort of start off with, you guys have made some beautiful publications in the past, and particularly for this new report that you've released this summer, what was sort of the key motivation for you when you were developing it, and why is 2025 such an important year, do you think, as well, also in terms of ecosystem development in France? Is there, what's going on politically? Why is there an opportunity now, and what was the sort of core motivation behind the report this year?
Well, it was Aurelian's idea initially, yes. So I'll let him speak.
Yeah, I had that idea since years, but as nothing happened before today in France, I couldn't write something. And it started, in fact, as a joke last year, because I published a report, but the report was empty. You just had the cover, and I just announced, here you will find what is the medical cannabis in France today. And it was like 15 white pages, like it was empty because we had nothing. And as for this year, for 2025, we should have some medical cannabis legalization. So we are, so for the context, we have an experimentation with 3,000 patients today for 4 years now. They are treated with, at the beginning, flowers and oils, and now just oils for 5 pathologies. So it's a restricted framework just to test not the efficiency of medical cannabis, because it was approved, but the feasibility of the prescription path. So how should the medical cannabis be prescribed by a specialized doctor and then brought to patients? It was really the objective of the experimentation, and after the experimentation, it should have gone to a generalization. And due to a lot of political turnout, we have some delay, but in January, we thought we will, France will move forward around summer this year. So it was the time to write the report on what was the basis of medical cannabis industry in France. So where does it come from the experimentation, obviously, and where it will go, and what forces do we have in play? So which companies are already here, which companies are already interested, and obviously we put inside the report all the contacts we have and our 10 years of experience and of friends and companies that we know that are working in France. So it was really a bit of us inside the report, because it was everything we had in mind, and everyone we know that is already working. And the objective was just to describe what is in play in France, obviously what are the opportunities and the challenge, and just give the reading the comprehension keys to companies, to players, but also to political people, to professionals interested in medical cannabis in France, just so they know everything about it. And as you said, it's pretty elaborate, comprehensive. It's a big report. We really dive into things because we know them better. And I think it's the most complete report you can have on a framework, because it comes from the basis to the top.
Amazing. Thank you, Aurelian. And I'll maybe add to that, whilst we're talking about the report, you can actually download the report from the Augur website. So if you go to their website, Augur Associates, you can download that now and read along as we're talking about it.
Exactly. You can download it on Augur Associates website, and we wrote it in French and in English because we wanted to make it European and not only French. Obviously, we had a big coverage in France due to our channels, but the European part was pretty huge because we launched the report during Cannabis Europa in London. So a lot of European industry, medical cannabis people were there and downloaded the report.
Thank you, Aurelian. One thing that I think was made, I'll come back to getting your thoughts on the UK cannabis ecosystem. But what might be a nice starting place is to maybe if one of you could set the scene for people who don't know too much about the current sort of cannabis landscape in France at the moment. Because I know you've got a lot of complex elements, a bit like the UK, where there's a bit of a hemp market, there's a bit of a wellness market, there's a bit of a medical market. Would you be able to give a little quick overview of sort of how the French ecosystem looks at the moment in 2025?
So I think the comparison with the UK is interesting to play with, because it is, I would say, an opposite kind of market. So in terms of not only its form, but also I would say its soul, and the difference being that it's a highly regulated, public-based market. So you don't have private prescription and public ones. It's only public ones. And products, even if it's an ongoing conversation, will be reimbursed. So it's an important component and a big difference to some of other existing medical markets, closer to the German one in some capacity, even if the process for reimbursement will be different. And the second, which differentiates, I think, it a lot to in comparison to the UK, Germany, is that there is no confusion with a not so medical market. It's a highly pharmaceutical, strictly medical one. You cannot access it. If for now, if it's last resort. It's only for people that don't have other solution for now. You need to go see a specialist in the first place, and then often after that first prescription, it's slide down to a GP because they need to enroll new patients, and they're not necessarily paid to do that. So usually it's diverted quite quickly to the GPs, which is a good thing, and it's one of the bottlenecks that we see. So we do need more training in regard to doctors. One of the things that also differentiates France, I think, is the level of preparation, the readiness of the stakeholders, including the distribution part with the pharmacist and the prescription part with the SP and the GPs. So we have about more than 3,000 practitioners that have been trained before the actual start of the general market. So I don't think that was the case anywhere else in the world, probably. So that's a very solid start, even if that won't be obviously enough, but it will grow as the patient pool grow. If we go towards the type of products that is authorized, every product is authorized, but at least one form, which is the flower under its raw form. So you cannot be prescribed and go and get your flowers. So obviously this was somehow a political decision, which I actually look at it in the good side. It will help a lot cannabis become mainstream, because the flower in its raw form would not be present. So it will ease a lot of issues, especially in regard to prescription. The flower can be prescribed as under sealed caps for vaporization. So that's, I think, something that will become some kind of a norm in the future, because it is very pharma oriented. The patient doesn't have to do anything. It's just the caps, boom, in the vaporizer. The vaporizer being subsidized by the state also. It's so if it is recognized as a medical device with a CE marking, that is something that is integrated into the reimbursement, which is important. And then any kind of other product form where you can argument for the therapeutic value of having that product form brought forward. And then you do a product registration. So product is a product form and its iteration. What they will look like, there's kind of 3 ratios: the high CBD, high THC, and kind of a middle one. Obviously, you can do everything in the between, but you will end up in those categories. And you can imagine anything. And I think it will be very important for the development of the market to see the innovation coming into the French market, because they will need to be very useful to patients in order to create that relationship in between patient and labs. And so you will see, I think, a lot of innovation into that market that is highly imbricated into the way public health mostly work in Europe. And that's the last thing I will mention here, is I do think that because it is so imbricated into the health system, so you have no specific cannabis things, no licensed cannabis specific, that will create, as we've seen in the UK, a lot of arbitrary decisions. So you cannot have that in France. So it's a narcotic like any other. So it's a bit too much in terms of how it's probably handled for now. But this is something that is integrated into the system. We haven't created nothing really ex nihilo, except some specific things, like when you're registering a product, you don't need to bring clinical data. Those products can be used for several indications. So when, contrary to when you're registering a product with a market authorization, it's for a very specific indication. So there is differences that have been integrated, but it's mostly because there is an understanding of the specificities of cannabis. But aside from that, it's streamlined into the healthcare system. And I do think this will be something that can be replicated at the European level, and that will heavily influence the way supranational regulation will come in the next 5, 10, 15 years, because it's aligned with the way, pharma and health work in Europe, and there is no confusion with non-medical users.
That's super interesting, Ben. I think a lot of UK cannabis organizations and maybe clinicians, doctors might be quite interested to hear that, firstly, there's no cannabis flowers allowed, which I think causes a lot of problems in the UK and elsewhere because of that sort of
stigma, confusion.
And it's not, I guess, the typical format that patients are used to receiving medications in as well. Like right. I'm receiving a flower through the post, which is a really interesting approach. And then also the reimbursement side of things. The reimbursement's not particularly great here in the UK for British patients. And then the fact that it's been nationalized as well and just integrated into the existing healthcare structure for France, I think that's really interesting too, because in the UK, we get told it's impossible, it'll never happen, you've got to do all the clinical trials first. And yeah, considering we're 2 hours away on a train, it's very interesting that you've managed to make it work in France, which, yeah, I think a lot of people in the UK maybe won't believe that, that's possible. Overall, guys, what would you say is the sort of main constraint at the moment for the French medical cannabis ecosystem? Is it the fact that it's sort of nationalized in the public health system, or is it some of the supply chain side of things? Is it the regulators? What would you say is the biggest constraint at the moment to more people getting access?
The first blockage is the political one, obviously, because we need a signature of 2 decrees, and then maybe the opinion of the high authority of health concerning the reimbursement of the medicine. So we're waiting for administrative tasks. But once it is done, the main blockage will be the rollout of the framework. But like everywhere else, it will take time to have patients, to have trained doctors, and to have products. But it will only be a matter of time because all the processes already exist. As Ben said, we didn't create cannabis restricted area. It's just like any other drug. And maybe easier because we don't need clinical data. So the time will be important. And I believe the first fights for cannabis drugs will be really looked after and really observed by the authorities, just to take time on the first, and then it will be quicker and quicker and quicker. And obviously, the more trained doctor we have, the better it will be for patients. And once patients begin to have cannabis medicines, more patients will be interested in knowing about what is it and how they can be helped, and also. But so political blockage for now, and then it will be the standard bottlenecks of a new industry and a new product on the market, even if it's for patient.
And I would maybe complement by saying that the whole process, starting in 2018, has really been plagued by our political class. The biggest issue has been the National Assembly dissolution, so of the parliament getting back into election with a new government. And we have a weak majority, which is creating a lot of issues, and still it is the case now, with a lot of, stigmas keeping out with the Interior Ministry, what they do. It's the Home Office on your side, and it's about giving them credits about, what will cannabis use medically be, and one of the resulting option of this discussion was the interdiction of the flower. Again, I do think that it will work into the whole process favor ultimately.
Beautiful, Ben. Thank you. So bringing it back to the report there, as you mentioned, what would you say were some of the more surprising results that you found from doing your investigations and doing your research? Were there issues that you didn't expect to see, or were there issues that perhaps contradicted some of what the sort of conventional wisdom would suggest whilst you're doing that research? So whether it be on the patient side, the medical side, the supply and production, were there things that sort of stood out to you, or things that were a bit of like a shock, perhaps?
One thing comes to mind on my side, and it's a detail, but when I went into digging into the inclusion criteria of the 5 conditions that we have under the experimentation, which that list might be enlarged, in the next step, but for now it's those 5 indication. One of the big one that encompass a lot of things is oncology. So everything related to cancer treatment, HIV, and so on. The surprising thing came with the realization that you could not access medical cannabis if you were undergoing chemotherapy. It was only if you were in remission, in stop, or in between, but you could not do it while you were under chemo. So I won't go into the details. It's based on some specific issues related to the science of it, but for someone who has an historical perspective into what medical cannabis is and how it got started in the modern era at the end of the 20th century in Canada, in California, the driving force behind those changes were patients that had HIV, and people who were doing chemo, people who needed that support for getting their appetite back, getting some sleep, just ameliorating their quality of life, who in this occasion could mean the difference in between life and death. Resulting of this is an absolute bunker, for anyone who knows a little bit about this question. Looking at the details, there is reason behind, but that's one of the things that will obviously try to start to enlarge and to change, because it will impact tremendously a lot of people. And right now, it is not even touching the potential that it could have. So that's one of the things, and there's obviously a lot of others like this.
Yeah, Aurelian, do you have anything to add to that? Whilst
No, nothing was a surprise.
well, I was going to say, like, after 10 years of
Yeah.
we probably expected and know a lot of the issues that are there already. But it's interesting that cancer, put so much data coming out now around, say, chemotherapy and nausea and pain with related to cancer, that it's interesting that France has taken that very conservative approach. But I can also understand why, when there is this sort of potential for cannabinoids to also provoke cancer or support the growth of cancer too. So it's so interesting to see different interpretations nationally, because the UK at the moment, there's a big push for patients on chemotherapy to be able to access some of the medicines to support.
It will come online. I think it's just the parameters of the experimentation, even if they've changed along the years, and giving credits to the CST, which is the committee that was in charge of developing the program, they've integrated and they've adapted little by little, looking at some things that weren't working. But at the same time, they needed to be very cautious and make sure that everything was clear and kind of squared, and there couldn't be any issue that could be used afterwards to nullify the experiment and use it to abolish it. And we didn't need that for those pushes to be present, So I think the idea was to say, okay, so how can we maybe close it to a point where it becomes a bit paradoxal, but we get some members in and we show them that it's useful and that can be done, because it was the prescription, but also the distribution that was assessed. So I think one of the biggest difference with the UK is that at the beginning of the experimentation, as Aurelian said, they were already they've chosen those 5 conditions as being the ones that had already enough data to show that it was useful and even could be actually useful to patients, right? Especially the ones that where nothing else worked. So the idea is not to show that it can actually have an impact. We don't need to fall into I would say the pharma trap, where cannabis needs to show 100 years of scientific research, including clinical data, when it wasn't allowed to do that, and making that prerequisite for accessibility into a healthcare system is another way of just banning the substance, right? So we do have the capacity to show real life data, observational studies at a very, very large scales, and obviously the clinical data is coming in, but you need a lot of resource, which the cannabis industry doesn't have, notwithstanding the time that they didn't have to do those decades long of research that the pharmaceutical industry was able to do for some other product, like, let's say, opioids, for example. And so it is one of the constraints, which makes me like the French regulation a lot, because that has been resolved. This is not how indications will be decided for the inclusion, even if obviously this is taken into account, but this is not the only thing that needs to be put forward. And if there isn't enough data to a point where we know it worked, but we can't really prove it to the extent where a market authorization we need it to be, well, we'll let it for the Jazz and some other companies that want to go this way. We have the capacity to show that some other product forms can be allowed, and France has resolved it in parts by creating kind of a provisional registration process. So when you do the product registration, it's valid for 5 years. And at the end of that 5 years, you can renew it. There's a process that is not as long as registering a product, but that allows for a differentiation in market authorization and how that can be included into the healthcare system.
One last surprising thing, not for me, but for people who don't know how this works, is that for the experimentation, patients weren't allowed to drive their car. So it was a huge hurdle to recruit patients because patients for the experimentation were in the majority already cannabis users, so they were already driving their car by treating themselves illegally. And that is what seems that should be resolved for the legalization. You should be allowed to treat yourself and to drive your car.
And it's actually a big black hole, even because for other medication, again, like opioids, it's not always super clear when you have a prescription, you get arrested, you get tested positive, and you show your prescription, then it can sometimes depend of the goodwill of the police and then of the next steps in the judiciation of the process. It creates hassle for the patients, and so that will be an issue during the generalization. There is absolutely no discussion but what we've written extensively in the report on that topic, because it's a huge bottleneck and it's a huge inequalitative accessibility for patients, because mostly the ones that can not drive are the ones that live into a big city like Marseille, Lyon, and Paris. Everyone else, they need their car. So there is a capacity to, under the control of the prescriber and under the responsibility of the patient, like other drugs, to have pictogram information and specific guidelines that you need to follow in terms of precaution and assessment of the viability of your capacity to drive. But this is, again, something that is and should be the responsibility, like with other drugs, in the hands of the patient and its prescriber.
Very interesting. We've got a similar issue with the policing of patients who are consuming cannabinoids, because even with the prescription, like you're saying, a lot of the police may be so discretionary and they treat it very much as like a binary cannabis in your system, straight to jail, without looking at the prescriptions. And then also, a lot of police don't realize that there are cannabis medicines that can be accessed, that can be legal. So interesting that you've still got that kind of like restriction around driving, but the actual number of medicines or the registration of medicines is quite open. So I find that interesting, because it's, again, total opposite approach to maybe the UK and what we've gone for, really strict on the medicines, and then a bit of a free-for-all when it comes to like the use cases. But particularly from the report, what I found really interesting was the pilot study program that's been going on in France. And I was wondering if you'd be able to walk people through how that pilot program has been set up, how it works, and then maybe some of the findings from that pilot program as well. And I mean, the UK didn't have a pilot program at all, particularly. We just went straight for the law change and the doctors can figure it out. But for you guys, given you've written such a beautiful overview of that pilot program over the last couple of years, could you just give us a bit of an overview for people that maybe aren't aware of that program, how it works?
I'll summarize something very quick and that Aurelian can complete. But I think the bottom line is that there is nothing to say. Everything went well. And that's the whole point of the pilot program. It was a political need in order to show that cannabis could be used to patients. It could be handled, prescribed, distributed in a pharmaceutical way. There could be no issues in terms of diversions, in terms of side effects, and all this. So basically, you've had a government interim report who kind of assessed everything midway, and it was during COVID, so that we had some issues and some delays. There were a report made by a polling company that basically looked and interviewed patients and got their feedback. So that was a very important thing, where you can see that most patients said they had a positive experience with the products. Then you had one who was about addictovigilance and pharmacovigilance made by the ANSM. And this one was also no problem on site. There's no issues. Similar to, in terms of side effects to some other existing things. And one last report that was done in order to gather kind of what was the rollout, so the effectiveness of the distribution and the prescription capacities. And all of them were spotless into saying everything is green. As you know, in drug policies, it's not because you have science, reason, proof on your side that you will ultimately go towards that direction. But if you didn't have them, then you could not even, walk through the door and start to doing the path. So that was needed. And I think the bottom line is there is not much to say about the experimentation. Everything went well, aside from the fact that we had a couple of thousand patients, some issues in terms of inclusion. But I think the process with all the issues that it encountered, with outside of the question of medical cannabis, is that everything went well. And we knew that, but we need to do that before.
It was a belt and braces experimentation. And if we didn't have it, we wouldn't move forward. And that was, I believe, in the mind of the politician who created the pilot, which has become health minister in the while since the launch for a few months before a new assembly came and a new political turmoil. But it was belt and braces. It was needed, and everything went well. So now patients are really patient, they are waiting for their treatment.
I was going to ask you next, guys, about the patients now, because I guess the policymakers and the industry people like to make a lot of decisions on behalf of patients, and often we don't hear how the patients feel about the policies or sort of what their experience is. So how would you say patients are sort of responding to the policies at the moment, this new sort of nationalized structure? Is there support there for them? What's it like from that sort of patient perspective at the moment? What's their experience like? How does it compare?
I think there is a lot of frustration. Because the process is really slow. A lot of them, are in critical state, and they don't have months of wait that often the political timing is demanding. So for those who suffer, it's always easier to see it as advancing the best it could. For a patient that cannot access its medicine, it's an outrage, and with good reason. The accessibility capacity, the criteria to be included are fairly difficult, including, getting a meeting with your pain specialist or whoever specialist that is in capacity. Often, you're in a region where there is one or two centers where you can go with a long list of waiting. So it's a difficult path as an individual patient, and it is an even more difficult path for collective representation, because there is almost no support coming from the industry in that regard, at least not to the extent that they should. At the same time, giving a clear view of why it's very difficult for the actors in France to do so. They have very little means. They have so many things that they need to face, and often that's the case for other companies abroad that want to come into France. But it's, for me, it makes no sense, creating thoughtful and ethical partnership in between patients and medical cannabis company is the best structure that you can put in place for both actors. Patients are the best brand ambassadors. When they like your products, they say it, and they have no issues in telling it. I think it's quite prominent in the UK, and at the same time, I think the companies have not only an ethical obligation to support those patients, to have their voice being expressed directly and not through different any kind of means, but the capacity to self-organize and being in responsibility of your own development and your own treatment and your path towards remission is something that is highly needed to be taking by the patient as a responsibility that they can move and take, and they have autonomy into that perspective. I think it's important. And so we don't have that so much in France, and the only patients that are mostly active come from association for specific indications, so like rare illness. And the idea is, how can we help as Augur, as Newsweed, also in bridging those gaps, in bringing budgets and capacity to patient organization, because ultimately they are the ones that are being listened to the most. You can, do communication strategy and help them have their voice being heard, and at the same time using them in a political strategy of influence, because it's a win-win solution. This is something that should be done, I think, in a more structured manner in France, and not just when we hit a roadblock. So we do need better structuration towards patient support in France.
Given how much research you've done to put the report together, what were some of the recommendations that you've now maybe got for the industry and for regulators to start moving this sort of early foundational program that's been established? How can the government move it forward? How can healthcare professionals move it forward? How can the industry support? What were some of your recommendations there as to maybe what could be done to start progressing and tackling some of those problems that you mentioned earlier on?
Yeah, so for French regulators, the main thing to address are the blockage we identify, the challenges that were present everywhere else in the world, but especially in Germany or in the UK. So focus on training the doctors, help patients really access the medicine. And it's not a political decision, but be really aware of if the cannabis-based medicine are not reimbursed, they will not be accessible. So you can put pressure on the health authority of the High Authority of Health for that, but just knowing it. One last thing is also help French companies to set up and to begin the production of medical cannabis for French patients, medical cannabis and its product. And we already have some French companies that have the right to cultivate medical cannabis for research purposes. For now, and they will be the first to cultivate for patients as soon as they have the right to do. Some of them already have products almost approved, so oils mostly. So once again, it will take time, but some of companies which are really resilient, because some of them started a few years ago now, and they also are waiting for the market to open and to really bring that product to patients. And for outside foreign companies, support patients and support the lobbying efforts, give money to people in France for to make things move. It is the first step to help French patients. And if you really care to patients, that's the first thing you have to do. Waiting for a market to open is easy, Helping this market to open is a bit more difficult, but it's more prestigious and it's more valuable for you and for patients. So as Benjamin said, we know that medical cannabis is in fact a little market, which sometimes huge valuations, but nothing behind. So that's a tricky mind to think that all the companies have a lot of money to give, but sometimes it's just helping one patient, two patients, and by beginning to help a few people, you will and by helping a lot. like in the UK, Billy Caldwell and all the advocating move behind that, I'm pretty sure will end to create a fair industry for British patients. And we don't have this type of example like young children with epilepsy, and also in France. Maybe we should have, but you can't take sick people by the end like that to be mediatized. To be in front of the camera, especially in France, cannabis use is highly enforced, as you know. So it's a risk to say that you are giving cannabis to your child, you know. But yeah, you always have the possibility to help some patient, and it will be a first step for foreign companies to put a foot inside France.
Please. To follow up on what Aurelien was saying, I think there is obviously the administrative obstacles and the lack of political leadership in general that needs to be tackled at different moments. There is a need to support research, clinical research, but also research and development, adapting research methodologies, you know, for studies on medical cannabis to make them relevant and applicable into the real world. I think it's paramount, going towards clinical audits rather than long clinical studies. The R&D for the national sector is quite important. The question of, you know, working towards the communication of the companies, of the industry, for the patients, for the prescribers, this is a little bit blurry for now. There is the question of training for all the actors of the chain, you know, the doctors for the prescription, the dosage, the pharmacist, and then you have all the healthcare professional around that, you know, in regard to healthcare assistants that we can think of that are often in first line. And I'm thinking of nurses, for example, that need training because they will encounter issues with patients that are going under treatment with medical cannabis. And then you have all the gaps into the patient accessibility that I've mentioned a little bit before, but there's the question into the workplace environment, the clarification of the accessibility process, the need to put in place peer support process in between patients. Patient cards like we have in the UK and some other countries, you know, could be an option also to put in place. The question of authorization for traveling inside Schengen, outside Schengen, inside France, outside France, the papers that you need to, how you make that easy for the patients. The right to drive, as we've mentioned, is quite important. And then there is working into the, you know, the prescription process, and from a last resort to the full inclusion into the pharmacopoeia, and getting into, you know, first or second indication would be nice. Working into the inclusion criteria, the public reimbursement needs to be cleared out. And then even if it's not, you know, aligned with France and the way we're doing things, we'll still advocating for self-production and compassionate social clubs that we do think is one of the output of medical cannabis that should exist, but it's not going to happen in the short term in France, that's for sure, but that's something that we support.
We've mentioned there a couple of times companies that are potentially entering France, and over the last couple of years, since the sort of European landscape opened up to more cannabis industry, medical potential, we saw a lot of North American companies coming over to Europe. What advice would you have for potentially new companies looking at France? What are some of the challenges or red flags that you look for? And then what are maybe some of the opportunities as well that you see? And then maybe a couple more business questions for you afterwards. But with this new influx, I suppose, of companies and people maybe want to start a business in France around cannabis, or they're in the UK and want to export to France, what sort of advice do you have for them, and what sort of opportunities do you see?
The main advice will be to contact us first.
Good support.
Yeah, good support. No. To be true, the main hurdle for them is that they will have to find a French partner, and not talking about this. compulsory, but because the way it has been framed is inside the pharmaceutical framework in France, so they will have to find a pharmaceutical partner here. They will have difficulties to set up a new company in France alone and clear all the details and the obligation for them alone. So it's maybe on another country it was easier to do that, and previously to the law edictment. For example, all the Canadian companies entered really early the medical market. For example, in North Europe or in Africa, because they could do so, and they wrote or helped to write the law with the local government. But in France, it's too late for that. So they will have to find a French partner, and that's probably the best thing to do to address the market quite rapidly.
I would say, jokes aside, that you do need to get a clear picture into what it entails to come into France. And so often we work, into small strategic entry study in order to understand what do they want to do, what's feasible with what they have, what is the best pathway to enter the market, because there are several. One of the big one being that you need to have an exploitant pharmaceutical partner, or you need to get this license yourself. Those are two of the passes, and often it's complex for foreign companies to understand how the French process work, and that's where we come in, and we have legitimacy and a real help in trying to decipher all this, in merging the cannabis industry with the French healthcare system, and working with pharmacists that have worked with medical cannabis products in the past. There isn't a lot. We know all of them. We work with them for some years, and same thing with the exploitant pharmaceutical units that you'll need to engage with. It is a work, an important one to find a reliable partner. You mentioned red flags a little bit. Well, when you have companies, when we explain them a little bit of the process, the thing that they need to do, and if they choose not to understand and don't want to do those things, or don't necessarily have the little money that it demands at the beginning, well, those are what we consider as not necessarily being serious, at least for the moment, and therefore it helps us screen a little bit. And then we like the way the French framework is made. Something that we haven't mentioned is that the products, they need to be full spectrum, for example. So no synthetic, no isolate, no all those things that we don't necessarily like so much into the medical cannabis ecosystem, because we know the power of the plant and what it can bring if it's well done, and not just the qualitative aspect of the pharmaceutical spectrum, but also the qualitative aspect of the cannabis spectrum, which are two different things. And so how we work best with companies that understand the value of that intersection. We also work well with companies that have a very pharma, I would say, orientation, because they are calibrated to deliver innovative product form, and that will give them a competitive advantage, that will make them being looked upon favorably by the regulatory authority and so on. And at the same time, we do love to work with, I would say, more legacy, OG kind of companies coming, for example, from Canada, and how we can help them. Often they have experience in bringing medical grade products to Europe. So how we shift them and make them being able to come to France is one of the things that we like to do also, because they're bringing qualitative products. And ultimately what we want to do is to give the patients the choice and give them the possibility to market, and choose the products that work. So our objective, we work with a lot of different companies. We're apolitical a little bit on that aspect, and we have a capacity to help put forward some of the most promising products that I think not only France, but the continent will see in the upcoming years.
Maybe a small change of perspective then, as we're talking a bit more about you guys now in Augur. We've talked about, and I think a lot of people focus on some of the medical potential side of things, which is great, but there's also a lot of like the green environmental opportunities and sort of areas of value that can be created that I think a lot of people maybe overlook when they talk about cannabis and hemp too, especially. I think maybe what might be interesting for people who don't know you guys so well yet would be a bit of an introduction to Augur Associates, but also some of your ESG work, your hemp work, and then your carbon credits work as well, which I find particularly interesting, because this is like a whole new, like almost like a second generation industry off the back of cannabis that sort of emerged. Would you be able to walk people through some of the sort of innovative services that you've developed as well to help companies sort of still create value even whilst the medical market's still sort of emerging and getting established?
Yeah, I will do Augur and all the ESG and credit carbon. As for Augur, so the big line is that we are helping companies enter a market, a cannabis market, either for CBD products, CBD accessories, medical or non-medical cannabis products. Our day-to-day clients are mostly CBD companies and accessories. So, for example, we help them file some dossier for a product authorization. For example, a Dutch company want to work in Spain, so we are helping them with a lawyer advice and then market studies, just how they can market their products from one country to another. On the medical part, is mostly product authorization for France for now, but we also helped people figure out how they can have their license in other countries. For example, in Africa or in South America. We were mostly contacted by French people because French people like to work with cannabis plants, but not in France, as they can't until now. But as we are pretty visible on social network and on search engines, they found us and they like to work with French people for their licenses. On non-medical market is mostly government advices on how they can try to go on non-medical market. But it's mostly that market study and business advice. We used to work on finance, mostly for French companies. But it's a huge, we had huge difficulties to find people who are ready to put their money in cannabis company in France, cannabis or hemp. Whatever, but because the regulatory environment is not ready to ease the financement of companies, so they were afraid mostly of putting their money inside. We begin to see some public institutes putting money in medical cannabis medical companies, so it's a good start. But for individual, it's still a bit sketchy. So that's on what Augur works, and Benjamin created a bridge between this market and all the environment ESG criteria.
So yeah, we as Aurelien said, Augur works on, they said, the wellness, the medical, the adult use, or the non-medical at different level, and then we have the part on industrial hemp, and we started working in the dimension of carbon credit generation with certain end products from industrial hemp, so mainly hempcrete, a little bit of isolation, so the mats and so on, and the biochar, which is being produced with the waste of a bioproduction, and it creates this amazing products that you can use in many different applications, and it traps carbon inside, so you can certify this and monetize that capture, which is what we help companies with. So we've done carbon credits generation with the highest level of recognition for the first time in the world, I believe 3 years ago, with a French and then a Belgian company working in hempcrete. We are supporting a lot of other companies throughout the world doing that same process. So basically it is a financial tool to help support the scaling up of the hemp industry. So that gives a financial incentive to go towards those products, to use them, to produce them. It makes them on par economically with whatever replacement that they need to substitute. And so that financial incentive coupled with kind of a regulatory obligation that is more and more important to do things the green way or in a sustainable way. So hemp, as we mostly know, has tremendous potential. I would say that it's even bigger than anything the flower can bring, in itself, medical, otherwise. I think the impact, because it touches so many industries, can be gigantic. But the issue is, how do we get to scale? How do we get competitive? And that's where carbon credits come in, and that also help us branch out a little bit, especially with char and working with other kind of feedstock. And we also work with other biomaterials that can trap carbon, like bamboo, for example. And that really help us have several, revenue flows in terms of, organizing and structuring consultancy. It is important. And one of the things that I'm trying actively to do is bridging those different markets. And so, for example, with a medical or recreational cannabis facility that is producing a lot of waste, what do you do with this waste? Potentially there is a way to create biochar, which you can sell, which can generate carbon credits, which you can sell and bring revenue out of it. And that is something I think that is going to be paramount for cannabis, that it will need more and more to show that they do not have a negative impact on the environment. They will need to show, as we say in French, a white hand whiter than white. It's a little bit like showing more than you're supposed to do, but because it's cannabis and the stigma out of it, you need to do the extra mile. And that will be the same for the environment. And so the solutions that we come across and are developing with partners can be applied to the cannabis industry to a certain extent. And I think there is a duality that we need to breach because ultimately it is the same plant with different kind of uses and different kind of regulatory regulation attached to it. And so it is, I think, important to remember. And this is the raison d'être d'Augur, to work on all markets, being smart politically about it. It doesn't mean that we're pushing everything at the same time, the same way, and the same moment with the same people. But it is, an extraordinary plan that we should use to the fullest, and that's what we can do with the carbon credits. And it is, working well. So I invite anyone who is interested to contact us on that side, because it is honestly a very passionate area to work on, because we are at the forefront of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. It's definitely something that people overlook, I think, in particularly like the medical cannabis bubble that a lot of people get stuck in. I think a lot of times the pharmaceutical medical industries can also be quite wasteful just in general with medical waste and some of the approaches that get taken to keeping things sterile. You're going to keep things clean from contamination. But particularly with cannabis, it seems as though a lot of the facilities can also be quite sort of maybe uneconomical or unsustainable, perhaps, with the amount of carbon they produce, the amount of waste they produce. And it's strange that we've got a crop that can be so great for the environment, but we managed to make it so sometimes toxic and damaging in the process, whether it be water contamination or pesticides and sort of various elements.
I think the energy consumption is probably the biggest, one of the biggest issue when we're talking about medical cannabis. A lot of actors feel obliged to cultivate indoor, and there is some reasons of why to do it in regard to what kind of products, especially for the raw flowers that you're looking to get out. But there is also a capacity for regulators, especially in Europe, but also in other places, to over-regulate the plant, which put a lot of constraint on players, which in turn create those issues in terms of sustainability. And so I think it's not the private sector who is to blame. I think they have a lot of to do, but I think the regulatory framework that we have often doesn't allow for a lot of space in order to do things differently in a more sustainable manner, because sometimes they're just not allowed to. And so we're trying to work in different jurisdictions with what is allowed, and at the same time potentially working towards changing that framework by showing that we can do some other way.
Incredible. I think the carbon credits is I think personally my favorite. I think that's the smartest way I've heard so far of solving multiple problems and then also doing it in a profitable, economically viable way as well. And I hope the UK takes on more of that approach perhaps and tries to factor in some of that, because we're building massive greenhouses, we're building huge facilities, which all has an environmental cost as well. So finally, chat, for the entrepreneurs that are listening, for the researchers, the investors, maybe the industry professionals that are listening to our little conversation here, they'd like to maybe support you, participate in some way, or be part of the development of the French cannabis ecosystem. How can they connect with you guys? How can they engage with you guys? And as well, could you tell people about all the lovely resources you've got on your website as well, and Newsweed, that people can benefit from to get more of a real-time perspective on what's going on in the world of French cannabis right here and right now? Where's the best place for them to catch you? Obviously, the Augur website, we'll put all the links in the description, but if you could just give people a little overview of how they can interact with you, get in touch and support you guys, that would be awesome.
Obviously, on the Augur Associates website, you will find all our intelligence materials. So the previous report we wrote, because we began to write some white papers 7 years ago on CBD, medical cannabis, how to legalize cannabis in Europe, non-medically. And today, the medical report we did on France, and that we want to do every year now.
They're all free. They're all free, open access.
And they are all free, exactly. You just have to put your email address to receive it, or send us a WhatsApp if you have our numbers. We will do it like that. And also, we also move from a fair to conferences in Europe when we can. So you can find me in Cannabis in Barcelona every year since 10 years now, in London from time to time, in Berlin too. And we love to meet people there and gather and partake a bit outside of the professional issues we can have.
Now to finish up, we have two things coming in that could interest people. There will be a Cannabis Europa in Paris at the end of February 2026. So that should be a good meeting place. And I think I'm not giving away too much, but I think when this video will be out, this would have been
announced.
So we should be safe on that side, and that should be accessible on their website. And the second thing is that we'll be at MGB Conf this December in Vegas. So for our North American compatriots, Canadians and US and South America that will be there, feel free to hit us up. It'll be a pleasure. We'll be at the hub where we have an hour on France, and we'll be part of many different events during the week. So be happy to see you there.
Amazing. I'll have to do a vlog or something, guys, because there's a lot to see at MJ BizCon. It's kind of like a mythical event for the Europeans to hear about. But I want to say a big thank you for all of the hard work that you've done over the years to champion cannabis in France, and yeah, you've really led the charge with making sure all the best information's out there, helping move along the political conversations, uniting different businesses. And I think you've got the best possible expertise really to lead the next generation of the cannabis industry in France. So yeah, I want to say a big thank you and a big congratulations. And thank you for putting all this information together for people. Beautiful reports, beautiful publications. I want to say I really appreciate your time today, guys. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and thoughts with our community. And anyone that does have questions about France, there are no two better men to speak to about French cannabis, hemp, ESG, and the potential of the French cannabis industry. So thank you both, Benjamin and Aurelian, for taking the time, and excited for Cannabis Europa in France. I encourage everyone to get in touch with the guys and connect with them in the community. We'll put all of their details below, so you can click the links, download the report, follow Newsweed, follow the guys on LinkedIn. Wishing everyone a beautiful week ahead and an amazing end to the summer.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having us.